I'm Gabi Coatsworth. It's the takeover of the English novelists type situation here, but I'll try and get over that. I have written a novel which is currently looking for its publisher, which I'm sure it will find shortly. But in the meantime, I wrote a memoir, which is with a publisher who actually might think about publishing it. So this is the beginning of my memoir. If you don't get it, it's because I didn't write it very well, so let's start. Summer 2014. I stepped out of the car after a 4-hour drive and checked out the house. It was missing the pots of flowers that I planted by the front door every spring, but otherwise appeared much the same. By the garage, Jay's vegetable garden seemed uncharacteristically overgrown. He was usually on top of every weed and slug, but the cucumbers, tomatoes and beans were rioting across the ground in cheerful abandon. Pulling my weekend bag and laptop out of the Prius, I walked into the kitchen and dumped them on the bright blue counters I'd chosen 10 years before when we built the house. They still looked like new and nothing was out of place, so I guessed my husband had tidied up, knowing I was coming. There was a stillness to the air inside, as though it hadn't been disturbed for a while. I couldn't see or hear anyone, so I walked through to the picture window in the dining room and gazed at the view. It was still beautiful, the lake serene. The lawn Jay had planted the year before stretched down to the water, and I could see a few sailboats racing in the distance. A day without a cloud on the horizon. Jay was lying on a chaise longue on the deck, his eyes closed. A glass of something stood on the side table beside him, sweating in the heat. As I moved forward, I scanned his face, wanting to get used to the idea of being there with him before he saw me. He'd lost weight, and when I looked beneath his tan, there were shadows around his eyes. "Hi, Jay," I said. His eyelids fluttered open. If all had been well between us, I would have called him Jayway or Darling, but all was not well. "Thanks for coming up, Gabi." "No problem." I'd decided to treat my visit as a weekend in the country and planned to read, swim and pick blueberries when I wasn't driving my husband to and from his medical appointment. He caught me glancing at his drink. "It doesn't make the pain any worse," he said, picking it up and taking a sip as though to prove it. I remained silent. It had all begun so differently so long ago. London, 1974. I heard about Jay Wilson long before I ever met him. I was 25, newly divorced, and the mother of 2 small children. I worked for a market research firm in London, part of a global network headed by Jay's company. Among other things, they commissioned the studies that we carried out for a well-known bra manufacturer. On a lovely day in May, my boss, Dawn, called me into her office. As it happened, Jay's American bra client was in town that week, and Dawn wanted to connect with this lucrative customer. But she had to fly to Copenhagen, so she delegated the job of contacting Cindy to me. "You're familiar with the projects. You've been working on them. Here's her name." She handed me a scrap of paper. "Ring her up at the Hilton and ask her to lunch. You're leaving for Denmark tomorrow, so today's your only chance." Taking a deep breath, I dialed the hotel and asked for the client, who answered in an attractive drawl that reminded me of Jane Fonda. She accepted my invitation and we arranged to meet in the lobby. I was checking my makeup before heading out when the phone on my desk rang. "This is Jay Wilson. Am I speaking with Gabi Coatsworth?" I confirmed that he was, liking his voice immediately, until he spoke again. "What the hell do you mean by asking Cindy Caballero out to lunch?" He didn't even pause for an answer. "She's my client, so I'm taking her to lunch. What's more, I'll be reporting your unprofessional behavior to your boss." As I hung up, I felt my face flushed with mortification. I sat in my office, my appetite gone and my heart sinking as I envisioned coming face to face with this man in Copenhagen at the annual meeting of the network. As head of it, he would certainly be there. Dawn had arranged for me to attend the gathering, to take the minutes and to meet people I'd only spoken to on the phone. I'd never been to such an event, nor seen Denmark, so having planned for my mother to have the children for a couple of nights, I felt a quick rush of adrenaline as I boarded the plane for Copenhagen. Only my unfortunate phone encounter with Jay worried me, and I mentally rehearsed how I would explain my failure to Dawn. Knowing I would meet Jay at the welcome cocktail event that evening, I'd borrowed a purple dress from a friend. The dress had a zip up the front, and checking it out in the mirror before I went down to the party, I felt reassured that I looked like someone who wouldn't let anyone intimidate her. I was standing near a window on the far side of the room with a glass of white wine, immersed in conversation with a man from the Paris agency. Barely disguising his boredom as he stared through his wire-framed spectacles, he paused and glanced toward the door. "Voilà," he announced, blowing out a stream of smoke from his Gauloise. "The uncouth Yankee has arrived." I must have looked somewhat blank. "It is Wilson," he said, "from New York." I followed his gaze and spotted the man with no trouble. I'd seen his photo in the network brochure, but it didn't do him justice. Handsome in what we thought of then as the all-American style, he stood at least 3 inches taller than anyone else in the room. He was younger than I'd imagined, considering he ran such a big company. I discovered later he was 38. His blonde hair, aquamarine eyes, and pink complexion reminded me of early Technicolor movies. He wore a blue and white striped seersucker suit a la Gatsby, and his trousers were too short. We expected this sort of thing from our colonial cousins, knowing that they had no dress sense. Still, his presence commanded attention. The executives in the room may have been talking disparagingly about him only a moment before, but they came forward now, anxious to greet him. He appeared cordial but guarded, and as his eyes scanned the room, they fell upon me. His gaze widened a little, and I hastily turned my head to continue chatting to my French colleague. Since Jay had been so rude on the phone, I anticipated he'd be gunning for me again as soon as he realized who I was, just to drive home his point about not stealing other people's clients. I managed to avoid him for the remainder of the reception, but when we sat down to eat, I found Dawn and I had been placed at Jay's table. Someone introduced me, and I waited for a disparaging remark from the annoying American, but he acted as if we'd never spoken before. Grateful, I played my part by providing a little light relief from business talk. After dinner, the older members of the group excused themselves while the rest of us headed upstairs to the discotheque. It was only a matter of time before Jay asked me onto the floor. As we danced, he told me about his estranged wife and 2 little girls whom he clearly doted on. His trousers might have been too short, but when he clasped me to him, I felt an unanticipated current of magnetism between us. As the evening wore on, most of our colleagues deserted us, and eventually only he and I and a couple of others remained. It must have been well after midnight. From across the dance floor, I saw him sitting at the bar and walked over to perch on a stool alongside him. Apparently, he noticed. "Do you come here often?" he asked with a grin. I laughed at this cliché and explained that I'd never been to Copenhagen before. In fact, we were a few miles outside the capital. I don't know what made me say it. "How would you like to see Elsinore Castle?" "You mean Hamlet's Elsinore?" "Yes, they tell me it's not far from here, and I have a rental car. I'll bet it's lovely by moonlight." "Okay," he replied. "Why don't you head out to the parking lot and I'll join you in, say, 10 minutes. I understood the need for discretion, so I nodded, bid the stragglers good night, and headed downstairs, my heart pounding with excitement or anxiety. I wasn't sure which. I was beginning to regret this risky venture. If people found out I'd spent time alone with Jay, I'd be considered unprofessional, to say the least. I waited nervously in the chilly evening air, praying none of the dames who lived locally would catch sight of me as they left to go home. I focused on my breathing and began to feel calmer, less threatened by Jay's charm, his eyes which held mine, his smell of soap, and something indefinable that made me lean in to get more of it. My anxiety was waning considerably. Then I spotted a flash of light-colored clothing as he emerged from the side door of the hotel. We got into the car and I switched on the ignition. Now the die was cast. "So," I began, turning toward him. "So," he replied as he leaned over and kissed me. I kissed him back, one tiny logical voice in my head telling me this wasn't a good idea. His lips were warm, almost gentle, but the effect was electrifying. Perhaps that was what undid me. He wasn't insistent, which made me want him more. I had to stop. Now. I might not have stopped. That's all I have to say. Thank you.